Everybody, back up now. This is a security situation.
The police just tased Hank. On platform 12, 92-year-old man.
Police tased a 92-year-old vet at a train station. 5 minutes later, 100 Hells Angels shut down the platform. When transit police tased 92-year-old Harold Morrison for suspicious behavior at Penn Station, they didn't know the WWII veteran had spent 50 years rebuilding Hells Angels' Knucklehead engines, or that his brotherhood was already riding to his rescue. Penn Station's underground maze hummed with Tuesday evening chaos, commuters rushing through fluorescent corridors, Amtrak announcements echoing off tile walls, the eternal dance of arrival and departure that defined America's busiest transportation hub. At 7:23 p.m., the Washington, D.C. platform buzzed with business travelers clutching phones and briefcases while transit police maintained routine patrols, unaware they were about to trigger the largest motorcycle club response in New York City history. Harold Hank Morrison sat on platform 12, his 92-year-old frame bent over a worn leather satchel containing tools that had served him 70 years. His weathered hands, scarred from Normandy shrapnel and decades of motorcycle repair, trembled as he waited for the 7:45 train to Philadelphia, where his grandson's wedding would reunite scattered family. Those hands had rebuilt more than engines. They'd restored 1948 panheads to factory specs, bored out shovelhead cylinders to 80-inch displacement, and hand-lapped knucklehead valve seats with precision that modern machines couldn't match. For 50 years, Hank had operated Morrison's motorcycle repair in Newark, the only shop where Hells Angels trusted their iron horses to civilian hands, especially the temperamental knuckleheads that required understanding their oil circulation quirks and timing advance mechanisms. Presidents from Oakland to Boston sought his expertise with pre-AMF Harleys, while Sonny Barger himself had brought his troublesome 47 Knucklehead when no Harley dealer could fix its persistent oil leak. The Purple Heart in his pocket meant less than the honorary Hells Angels patch sewn inside his satchel, recognition earned through fair dealing, midnight emergency repairs, and refusal to betray confidences. Some bonds are forged in fire, others in grease and mutual respect, but the strongest are built through decades of keeping your word when it matters most. Sir, you've been sitting here 40 minutes. What's your business? Transit Police Officer Miguel Santos approached with routine suspicion, seeing only elderly man whose stillness suggested either mental illness or criminal planning, though his 7 years with transit police had taught him that loiterers meant trouble regardless of age. Hank looked up with eyes that had seen Omaha Beach and 1,000 broken motorcycles. Waiting for the 7:45 to Philadelphia, officer. My grandson's getting married tomorrow. Santos studied Hank's appearance with practiced assessment. Worn clothes, heavy satchel, no visible ticket, suspicious stillness that triggered his supervisor's recent emphasis on increased vigilance after security concerns. Sir, you've been motionless since 6:40, which constitutes suspicious behavior requiring investigation. Son, I'm 92 years old. Moving hurts, so I sit still until my train arrives. Santos saw threat rather than elderly passenger, his training emphasizing procedure over human understanding. I need to search your bag for security purposes. Hank's satchel contained precision tools worth more than Santos's monthly salary. Starrett micrometers for measuring cylinder bore wear, snap-on torque wrenches calibrated for Harley specifications, and custom valve lapping compounds he'd mixed himself. More importantly, it held his grandfather's Civil War medal, father's WWII Purple Heart, and D-Day commemorative coin. Family treasures accompanying him to family celebration. Officer, these are personal items and valuable tools that I'd prefer to keep secure. 20 feet away, Michael Torch Kowalski finished buying coffee before catching Metro home, immediately recognizing Hank's voice. The man who'd taught him to gap spark plugs by feel and rebuild linkered carburetors without manuals. Santos had been enduring his worst week. Internal affairs investigation, mandatory sensitivity training, and his captain's warning about the next incident triggering immediate review. He couldn't afford another report questioning his judgment, which made compliance non-negotiable, regardless of personal circumstances. Federal regulations require compliance with all security directives, and your age doesn't create exemptions. Hank understood Santos's position, but couldn't risk damage to irreplaceable tools and family heirlooms through careless handling by officer who saw objects rather than memories. Officer, I understand your authority, but this bag requires careful handling. I don't care about property concerns, Santos interrupted with escalating impatience. Compliance is mandatory, not negotiable. Hank, everything all right? Torch called out, his leather vest displaying patches that instantly changed platform dynamics. Santos spun toward the interruption, his hand dropping to weapon as large man in Hell's Angels colors approached what he'd classified as security situation. Both of you step back. Official police business. That's Hank Morrison, Torch said with calm authority. He's waiting for train to his grandson's wedding, no threat to anyone. Santos's training taught him that multiple subjects created tactical disadvantage, requiring aggressive response to maintain control. Hank raised weathered hands with muscle memory from dealing with authority throughout 8 decades. Officer, my identification is in my wallet. Don't move, Santos screamed, drawing his taser as Hank's movement triggered fight-or-flight response conditioned through years of assuming worst-case scenarios. He's getting his ID, Torch protested, stepping between Santos and Hank with protective instinct that had kept Marines alive through multiple deployments. Santos was beyond rational thought, his career anxiety manifesting as paranoia that saw threats where none existed. The electrical shock dropped Hank beside his satchel, while tools scattered across concrete like metallic tears. Precision instruments that had rebuilt thousands of engines now lying among Pennsylvania Railroad's forgotten debris. Torch immediately activated emergency alert through Hell's Angels network. All angels, Hank Morrison down at Penn Station. Transit cop tased our brother. Emergency response, now! His phone buzzed with responses from Manhattan, Brooklyn, Newark, Philadelphia, Baltimore chapters whose members had trusted Hank's expertise for decades. Morrison's motorcycle repair wasn't just business. It was family bond built through mutual respect and shared understanding of what loyalty meant. Pulse weak, breathing shallow, Torch reported while performing CPR on man who taught him everything about motorcycle mechanics, his hands working to stabilize the heart that had survived Nazi artillery, but might not survive American police incompetence. Sometimes the family you choose rides faster than the one you're born into. Within minutes, distinctive Harley rumbles echoed through Penn Station's underground passages as Hell's Angels members arrived from across the metropolitan area, their bonds with Hank transcending business relationships, since Torch's alert had reached chapters whose patriarch lay unconscious from police assault. Every angel within 50 miles is coming, Torch reported, while monitoring Hank's cardiac rhythm disrupted by electrical shock. Hank rebuilt my first shovel head, taught me to read compression ratios, never broke confidence. Blood debt. Santos watched his career dissolve as cell phone videos went viral, while social media exploded with outrage about police brutality against decorated military hero whose service deserved honor, not electrical violence. "I didn't know he was important," Santos stammered. "Every person is important, but Hank Morrison is legend, D-Day veteran, 50 years serving motorcycle community, honorary brother whose word is bond throughout Hell's Angels Nation," Torch replied with controlled fury. Penn Station security called for backup as Hell's Angels numbers grew from individuals to organized formations surrounding platform where their respected ally lay unconscious, their presence transforming routine police incident into potential confrontation between civilian authority and motorcycle brotherhood whose loyalty transcended jurisdictional boundaries. "We've got 30 Hells Angels on Platform 12, reported Transit Police Sergeant Rodriguez, while New York City Police Emergency Service Unit arrived to find jurisdictional standoff between Transit Authority and Motorcycle Club, whose members had every legal right to be present while protecting injured elderly veteran. "NYPD ESU, what's the situation?" Lieutenant Patricia Chen asked while assessing crowd dynamics requiring de-escalation rather than enforcement. "Officer Santos tased Hank Morrison, our mechanic for 50 years, explained Bones McKenzie, arriving from Manhattan chapter with authority that commanded respect. "We're ensuring he gets proper medical care." The irony wasn't lost on experienced officers. Hell's Angels provided better emergency response than transit police, whose officer had created the crisis through unnecessary force against vulnerable passenger. Captain Maria Vasquez arrived to find subordinate facing potential federal charges for assaulting elderly military hero, whose reputation was legendary throughout motorcycle community. "Officer Santos, explain your decision to use electrical force against 92-year-old veteran waiting for train." Emergency medical evaluation revealed Santos's taser had triggered cardiac arrhythmia in Hank's elderly cardiovascular system, while Hell's Angels numbers continued growing as word spread about assault on Morrison. Chapters from Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore converging on New York in largest coordinated response since the club's founding. "Mr. Morrison needs immediate cardiac evaluation at Bellevue," announced paramedic supervisor, while Hell's Angels coordinated escort, ensuring their honorary brother received appropriate care during crisis created by police misconduct. "We're at 75 members now," Torch reported to chapter presidents coordinating response that balanced concern for Hank's welfare with need to avoid confrontation that would distract from medical emergency requiring immediate attention. Santos faced suspension pending investigation while federal agencies monitored situation involving assault on elderly veteran by officer whose incompetence had endangered decorated war hero, creating international incident requiring diplomatic explanation to military community whose trust had been violated. Beyond individual misconduct, Santos's assault represents institutional failure requiring systematic reform, observed Captain Vasquez, while documenting evidence supporting federal prosecution. Congressional representatives demanded hearings about transit police training that enabled assault on WWII veteran whose service deserved protection, not persecution, by authorities whose ignorance endangered innocent civilians. Federal mediators arrived as Hells Angels numbers reached 80 members, their disciplined presence demonstrating organizational maturity that challenged stereotypes while protecting vulnerable ally from additional institutional persecution during unprecedented security situation that required immediate federal intervention. Gentlemen, we need peaceful resolution honoring Mr. Morrison's service while maintaining public safety, announced FBI Special Agent Lisa Rodriguez during meeting with Hells Angels leadership, whose authority commanded respect through different means than government institutions. Agent Rodriguez, Hank Morrison earned our respect through 50 years of faithful service, replied Thunder McKenzie, East Coast president, whose dignity matched federal officials' authority. We're here ensuring he receives justice for unprovoked assault on innocent elderly veteran. The negotiation revealed deeper issues about veteran treatment and police accountability that Santos's misconduct had exposed through catastrophic error affecting decorated war hero, whose service deserved institutional protection rather than individual persecution. Hells Angels maintained peaceful vigil while demanding accountability for officer whose incompetence had endangered community member whose integrity was unquestioned throughout motorcycle world that valued character over credentials. When you attack someone's grandfather, you attack their entire family, and Hells Angels have a very large family. Penn Station management ordered evacuation of Platform 12 as Hells Angels numbers reached 90 members, creating an unprecedented security situation that required federal intervention, while Hank's condition deteriorated as electrical shock overwhelmed his elderly cardiovascular system already stressed by travel fatigue. Mr. Morrison is experiencing cardiac complications consistent with electrical trauma, Dr. Sarah Martinez reported from Bellevue, while Hells Angels maintained vigil outside hospital where their honorary brother fought for life, endangered by police incompetence. Chapters from Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C. converged on New York in the largest coordinated response since the club's founding. Their brotherhood transcending charter boundaries when respected, Ally required protection from institutional failures that had endangered innocent civilians. Over 100 Hells Angels at Penn Station and Bellevue Hospital, reported NYPD Intelligence Division, noting that the situation remained peaceful but could become volatile if Morrison didn't survive cardiac complications created by unnecessary police violence. Santos faced federal investigation as video evidence revealed his assault was completely unprovoked. Elderly veteran had been simply waiting for train while posing no threat except to officers' predetermined assumptions about suspicious behavior that reflected training, emphasizing control over compassion. Federal mediators negotiated between Hells Angels leadership and law enforcement agencies whose authority was being challenged by motorcycle club demonstrating loyalty that government institutions couldn't command through official channels, requiring diplomatic resolution that honored both veteran service and public safety concerns. We need peaceful resolution honoring Mr. Morrison's service while maintaining public safety, FBI Agent Rodriguez stated during crisis meeting that would determine whether individual misconduct escalated into broader confrontation. Hank Morrison earned our respect through 50 years of faithful service to motorcycle community, Thunder McKenzie replied with dignity that commanded respect despite organizational stereotypes. We demand accountability for unprovoked assault on innocent elderly veteran whose service deserved protection. The negotiation exposed systematic failures in veteran recognition and police training that Santos's individual misconduct represented through catastrophic error affecting war hero, whose service deserved institutional protection rather than bureaucratic persecution by authorities whose ignorance endangered vulnerable populations. Hell's Angels' peaceful response demonstrated organizational maturity that challenged public stereotypes while establishing legitimacy as community advocates, protecting vulnerable members from institutional discrimination during crisis, that tested their commitment to lawful resolution rather than violent confrontation. Congressional representatives arrived to address incident attracting international attention as symbol of veteran mistreatment by authorities whose training failed to recognize military service requiring respect rather than suspicion from officers whose duty included honoring rather than harming defenders of a freedom. Hank's recovery enabled testimony about Santos's assault, while Hell's Angels provided security, ensuring elderly veteran could advocate for reforms, preventing future incidents involving police violence against vulnerable populations whose age made them targets for institutional failures rather than recipients of protection. Officer Santos tased me for waiting patiently for train to my grandson's wedding. Hank testified from hospital bed, surrounded by Hell's Angels, demonstrating community support that government institutions couldn't provide through official channels during medical crisis created by police misconduct. Federal prosecution of Santos created precedent for civil rights violations while establishing Hell's Angels as legitimate advocates whose peaceful response had protected vulnerable ally from additional persecution, transforming public perception of Motorcycle Club from criminal organization to community protector. The Morrison Protocol will establish federal protections for elderly veterans while requiring training about recognizing military service and treating aged citizens with dignity, announced U.S. Attorney during press conference that transformed individual tragedy into systematic reform, benefiting vulnerable populations nationwide. Santos received federal conviction, while Hell's Angels' disciplined response earned recognition as positive community force whose loyalty protected rather than endangered public safety through organized advocacy for vulnerable populations requiring institutional support rather than bureaucratic persecution. True brotherhood isn't about wearing matching colors. It's about standing together when one of your own faces injustice. Hank's recovery enabled return to Morrison's motorcycle repair, while Hell's Angels provided security during federal legislation establishment that created protections for elderly veterans based on his assault by transit police whose training had failed to recognize military service requiring institutional respect rather than individual suspicion. "Shop's been running fine while you recovered," Torch reported, while coordinating repair schedule maintained by volunteer Hell's Angels mechanics, who'd ensured business continuity during owner's hospitalization for police-inflicted trauma that had nearly ended his life. The Morrison Protocol passed Congress with bipartisan support, establishing federal protections for elderly veterans, while requiring mandatory training for law enforcement about recognizing military service and treating aged citizens with dignity rather than viewing them as threats requiring aggressive response. Legislation honors Harold Morrison's service while preventing future assaults on elderly veterans whose age makes them vulnerable to institutional failures, President announced during White House ceremony attended by Hank and Hells Angels leadership, whose advocacy had transformed individual tragedy into national policy protecting vulnerable populations. Santos's conviction created legal precedent while serving as warning about consequences of assaulting veterans whose service had earned protection from authorities whose duty included honoring rather than harming defenders of American freedom through military sacrifice. Congressional ceremony honoring Hank created national healing moment as Hells Angels received recognition for peaceful response to member assault, demonstrating organizational maturity that challenged public stereotypes about motorcycle club culture while establishing legitimacy as community advocates protecting vulnerable populations from institutional failures. Harold Morrison's courage in testifying despite cardiac trauma demonstrates service commitment extending beyond military discharge into civilian advocacy for vulnerable veterans. President declared during ceremony, recognizing both individual heroism and institutional support that had prevented escalation into violence. Thunder McKenzie received congressional recognition for community advocacy during crisis that had tested organizational discipline while protecting elderly veteran from additional persecution by authorities who should have honored rather than harmed decorated war hero whose service deserved institutional respect. Thunder McKenzie's leadership demonstrated that motorcycle clubs can serve positive community functions when their loyalty protects vulnerable members from institutional discrimination. House Veterans Affairs Chairman testified during award ceremony that helped transform public perception of Hells Angels organization. Implementation of Morrison Protocol faced resistance from law enforcement unions claiming veteran recognition training would complicate procedures while creating liability concerns that could affect officer decision-making during routine encounters with elderly citizens requiring specialized sensitivity rather than standard enforcement responses. Special provisions for elderly veterans create operational complications requiring additional training that strains departmental resources while potentially compromising officer safety. Testified police union representative during congressional oversight hearing questioning federal mandates affecting local law enforcement procedures. Hank's advocacy overcame resistance through Hells Angels' political influence that generated federal funding for implementation, while ensuring protocol served intended purposes rather than creating bureaucratic obstacles that would prevent effective law enforcement while protecting vulnerable populations from institutional discrimination. Morrison Protocol received full funding, recognizing that veteran protection serves national interests while improving police-community relations through education rather than enforcement. Senate Veterans Affairs Committee announced during budget approval celebrating legislative victory that honored military service. Santos completed federal sentence while beginning community service with veteran advocacy organizations. His personal accountability enabling recognition of warning signs he'd missed during incident that had endangered innocent elderly citizen whose only crime was existing while vulnerable in transportation system. Santos's rehabilitation demonstrates that individual healing can create positive change when people acknowledge harm while working to prevent future casualties through education rather than punishment, observed federal probation supervisor during progress review that documented transformation from perpetrator to advocate. His victim advocacy program provided crisis intervention training for law enforcement encountering elderly veterans during routine interactions requiring compassion rather than suspicion of vulnerable populations, whose age made them targets for institutional failures rather than recipients of protection. Santos's program prevented 43 similar incidents through de-escalation techniques that emphasized human dignity over procedural compliance. Reported evaluation after first year of implementation that had transformed perpetrator into advocate for populations he'd previously endangered through institutional ignorance. 3 years later, Hank celebrated his 95th birthday at Morrison's motorcycle repair, surrounded by Hell's Angels, whose loyalty had transformed from mechanical service relationship into family bonds that transcended traditional organizational boundaries, while honoring both military service and civilian dedication to motorcycle community. The Morrison Protocol had prevented over 200 incidents through training that educated law enforcement, while Hell's Angels maintained nationwide veteran protection programs, ensuring elderly military members received community support rather than institutional discrimination during vulnerable encounters with authorities requiring cultural sensitivity training. Hank taught us that respect isn't about patches or territory, it's about treating people with dignity regardless of their age or appearance. Thunder McKenzie observed during anniversary celebration honoring successful veteran protection advocacy that had transformed individual tragedy into systematic reform. Santos participated as reformed officer, whose transformation demonstrated that accountability could create systematic change when combined with community support and organizational commitment to preventing future harm, rather than perpetuating cycles of violence that endangered vulnerable populations unnecessarily. Hank smiled through tears, honoring both military service and civilian family that had chosen him through decades of mutual respect, proving that bonds forged in service, whether military or mechanical, created loyalty stronger than blood relations while protecting those who needed advocates most. The Morrison Protocol established federal protections for elderly veterans while generating $200 million in law enforcement training funding nationwide, ensuring cultural sensitivity education for officers encountering vulnerable populations. Santos's conviction created legal precedent for prosecuting officials who assaulted aged veterans, while Hell's Angels became legitimate community advocates whose peaceful response challenged organizational stereotypes through demonstrated commitment to protecting rather than endangering public safety. Hank's advocacy prevented 300+ similar incidents through specialized training, while Morrison's motorcycle repair became model for civilian motorcycle club cooperation that honored both mechanical expertise and military service through mutual respect, transcending traditional boundaries. 5 years later, Morrison Protocol had transformed elderly veteran treatment by law enforcement while establishing Hell's Angels as recognized community organization protecting vulnerable populations from institutional failures through advocacy that challenged stereotypes. At 97, Hank continued operating motorcycle repair shop while mentoring young mechanics whose skills honored service traditions transcending organizational boundaries between military and civilian communities. Santos's transformation proved accountability could create healing when combined with community support and commitment to preventing future harm through education rather than punishment. They learned that some bonds are forged in fire, others in grease and mutual respect, but the strongest are built through decades of keeping your word when it matters most, creating family that chooses loyalty over convenience and protection over profit in service of principles greater than individual interests. Some bonds are forged in fire, others in grease and mutual respect, but the strongest are built through decades of keeping your word when it matters most.